We continue our series today on Jesus Changes Everything. And it is good to be in worship with you moms this morning. And another thing I'm really excited about is we chose to use our own Jesus picture for our bulletins this morning. It's on behind me, and that's a picture that Chad took of our Jesus picture back in what we call the Jesus room. And it's presented up here this morning for the whole series, and wanted to do that. That picture is the oldest thing in the building, made about 1930. It was put in what became the Grace Epworth United Methodist Church building. And when East Cross and Grace Epworth joined together, then we grabbed the picture and ran from that building. So we have that picture this morning, and so we're glad to have that, and it's just really exciting for me as I finish my time here to use that for our bulletin covers. So we're talking about Jesus changing everything, and we're talking about it through the eyes of John the Apostle, or the Gospel of John. Now, John's called the fourth Gospel, sometimes because it's number 4 of the Gospels in order in the New Testament, but a lot of times it's referred to that among some of the scholars because it's different. They have the 3 Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, that all say things quite similar, quite a bit alike, tell the same kind of stories in the same ways, the Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then you have the fourth Gospel, which is the one that's not a synoptic. John has a different way of telling things and different way of saying things. And John really is most interested in telling us that this is what something meant. He'll tell us something, and then he wants to be sure we know what that meant. Or this is what, like the life of Jesus, this is what his life means, or this is how this affects your life. So if you're looking for what does it mean for our lives, then you're going to find that John gives us a really good picture of that. But to read through John, you have to learn to just kind of look at a little differently or read a little differently, because he doesn't read the same as the other Gospels. I would also remind us that John writes with one purpose. When you get down to John chapter 20, verse 31, he says this. He says, "But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name." So that's the reason John wrote his gospel. And in John's gospel, Jesus performs 7 miracles between the 1st and the 12th chapters. And so now what he calls them, though, are miraculous signs. We'll read that in this story in just a few minutes. But what he's saying is it's more than just a miracle, but we need to know why a miracle was performed. So a sign can be a miracle, but there's more to it than just a miraculous happening, that there's a reason for this miracle to take place, for Jesus to do a miracle. And so he's interested in us understanding that. So a sign is something that points to something beyond itself, and so it points to something else. So that's what we're talking about in these miraculous signs that we'll be reading about in John. So many times in John's gospel, Jesus' miraculous signs, as he calls them, point people to believe in Jesus Christ. These signs tell us something about Jesus' identity. He wants us to know who Jesus is. And also he wants us to know what Jesus either asks of us or demands of us. Because sometimes Jesus does both of those things, and so John's interested in us understanding that. John also tells us these stories about the signs Jesus performed to help us see beyond just the surface of what's happening, so we understand the deeper meaning of what Jesus is doing. So let's begin our story today. It's found in John chapter 2. And it begins this way. On the 3rd day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples were also invited to the celebration. When the wine ran out, Jesus' mother said to him, "They don't have any wine." And Jesus replied, some of my favorite passages right here. Jesus replied, "Woman," so let me tell you something. My mom was a little English woman, and there is a little English woman, about to turn 90, and still to this day, I would not dare go walk up to her and say, "Woman." I just don't do it. I just don't think I'd live through it. Jesus said, "Woman, what does that have to do with me? My time hasn't come yet." And then the best line of all, his mother doesn't respond to him. His mother just turns around to the servants, says his mother told the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." In other words, Jesus is going to take care of the issue. I love these stories of moms and their sons and their children. So this story, it says, did you catch at the very first? It says, on the third day. On the third day. Now, can you remember anything else that happens in the Gospels on the third day? Does anything ring a bell on the third day? Like resurrection, right? Right, so we have this third day thing going. Jesus raises up from the grave. So why would John tell us on the third day? Because you can go back to John 1, and we don't see anything that happens 3 days or 2 days before that, so that we would need to know on the third day, other than John wants to tell us that something specific happened on the third day. Maybe it was the third day of the wedding feast that they run out of wine, and they still had 3 days to go. But remember that the Gospels were written after Jesus' death and after his resurrection and ascension. And so I think it's possible that John, as he's writing these things down, he's saying, okay, we're not to Jesus' resurrection yet, but you need to pay some attention, because I'm going to tell you about life in Christ after his resurrection. And this picture of what happened here is a great picture of what goes on after Christ becomes, after he dies and then is resurrected, and we live in a new kingdom. So this is a story, even though it happens before the resurrection, it's a story, I think, that tells us in John's picture of wanting us to have signs, know what's happening. It's something that leads us to what takes place after. The story takes place at a wedding feast or banquet, and that's the dominant image, actually, of in the Bible of what heaven is like in the Messianic age. And twice in parables, Jesus uses wedding banquets as a sign of the Messianic age that's to come. And so in the Old Testament, we actually find that the wedding banquet is a picture of an age to come as well. So actually, wedding banquets were one of the happiest times in any village. For a family, they were the pinnacle experiences in life. And in first century Palestine, when most people were peasants, they weren't trying to figure out who has the latest iPhone. It was basically, we had enough food to live this year, isn't God good? And so that's kind of where they were in life. So most were peasants, and so they saved their entire lives, not for their children's college. They saved their entire lives for the weddings for their kids and the wedding banquet. So the wedding banquet in the first century lasted for about 7 days, probably 6 days, because of we had to have the seventh day to rest. But you fed, during that time, you fed your family and your neighbors, and there was wine, there was dancing, and it was definitely a joyous occasion. Matter of fact, it was something you never forgot. It was something you always referred to when you sat around at the gates to the village. People would talk for years. Do you remember back when Jeff and Rhonda got married, or do you remember back when they got married, or Matt and Jill got married, or you put your name in there? You remember back then? You remember what happened when this and this happened? And so it was they were the epicenter of all the great things in their community was at these wedding feasts or banquets. And so the wedding that John tells us about took place in Cana of Galilee. It's just a small village in the northern part of Galilee, and it's about 5.5 miles from Jesus and his hometown where Mary lived in Nazareth. And it probably would take about 2 hours probably to walk that distance. So they'd walk 2 hours to get to this wedding banquet. Mary, the mother of Jesus, was invited to the wedding, as were Jesus and his disciples. So they're all there, and the wedding goes off without a hitch, and everyone's enjoying the reception. And then suddenly something went wrong. They ran out of wine. Now, this is a big issue in that day because any good Jewish wedding needed plenty of wine in the same way that weddings today need plenty of cake. I mean, can you imagine if you ran out of cake and there's still 20 people in line? What will you do then? You just like turn red and blush and go, oh my, I can't believe this happened, right? Well, weddings have changed over the years. I understand that. You know, at most weddings that we attend today, the wedding lasts for about 35 minutes, depending on how many people it takes to get to the front and then get back out. And then also if the pastor's going to preach a sermon, how long it is. But then the reception lasts a couple of hours, and then everybody goes on their way. But in Jesus' day, the wedding took about 5 minutes. They didn't preach a sermon. And so 5 minutes, and then the celebration was supposed to go on for a full week. And so everyone in town looked forward to the wedding. It was a time for a feast. It was, and if you ran out of wine or ran out of stuff, then it was an embarrassment for the bride and groom and for the host family. It would be something that people would remember. It'd be like, can you remember when they got married and we didn't have any wine? I mean, they would talk about that for years to come. They would all be known as the wineless family. They'd probably end up changing their last name to wineless because that's how big it was at that day and time. And so the wine was an essential part of the occasion, and the rabbis actually in those days, they had a saying. They attended these things, one that did the weddings, and so they had a saying that said, without wine, there is no joy. So that was their saying. And so, and on top of that, hospitality was considered a sacred duty, not just something that was nice, but it was a sacred duty. So it was not that people wanted to get drunk, because drunkenness was a great disgrace then, even as it is now. But it would be humiliating for the bride and groom and for the host family if they did run out of wine during the party. It'd be memorable. So Mary, the mother of Jesus, went to him and she said, they have no wine. They have no wine. To which Jesus replied, what concern is that to me? And probably meant to you and me. We're not the host family. And then he continues, my hour has not yet come. So for Jesus' point, from his point of view, it wasn't his problem, but his mama. His mama is making it his problem, is what it sounds like. And even though Jesus didn't seem too thrilled about it, like a good Jewish mama, Mary just turned around, and instead of telling him, you better do what I say or else, she just turned around to the servants and said, you do whatever he says to do. Doesn't that sound like a good mama? My kids can do anything, right? Yeah, you think about your kids, and your moms think that about you. Yeah, my kids can do about anything. And so she looks around to the moment and she applies this truth to her, and she says, do whatever he tells you. Now let's stop for a minute, because I think this applies to us too. Do whatever he tells you. John, I probably underlined that in the original script as he wrote it. Do whatever Jesus tells you. I mean, we underline it here every week. I mean, every week for 10 years now, we've been saying, as we come together to worship, Chad asks, why are we here? And we respond, what? We're learning to follow Jesus, inviting others to join the journey. What we're saying is that we're learning better to do what Jesus tells us to do. See, that's the essence of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. Do whatever Jesus tells you to do. That is what it means to follow and to serve Jesus. We do whatever he tells us to do. But let's continue on with verse 6. Verse 6 says this, nearby, this as soon as Mary gets through saying that, nearby were 6 stone jars used for the Jewish cleansing ritual, each able to hold about 20 or 30 gallons. Now, John wants us to see another symbol in these 6 stone jars. They were used for ritual cleaning. Now, I'm guessing they probably borrowed some jars from some of their family and friends, because not everybody else would need jars for ritual cleaning at this time, because they were hosting everybody in the village. And so they probably gathered the jars that they could find from their close friends, and that's what what they were used for. They weren't used for anything else. They were used for ritual cleaning. The Jews believed that you needed to be ritually clean to get close to God. That was extremely important for them in their worship. This water was used for the Jewish ritual of purification to prepare you for worship. Now, what is worship? Worship happens when we come together to connect to God. Now, worship is not the songs we sing, but if we use the songs we sing to get close to God and to tell God what the songs are saying, if we are in our hearts and minds are connecting with God, then that is what true worship is. So to connect to God, to meet God, to get close to God, to be with God. And so the Torah had declared, and that's what they were used to, the Torah declared that one needed to get clean by ritual cleansing in order to be close to God in worship. And so they had the water there. They hadn't gotten water in these, and they used them to cleanse the feet of the guests when they arrived, cleansing as they arrived. And then also they would cleanse the guest hands before they ate, and also between the courses of the meals that they would have throughout the week. And so each one of the stone jars held about 20 to 30 gallons of water. That's what it says. I want us to look at that in a minute. But let's continue on with the story. Verse 7 says, Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some from them and take it to the head waiter." And they did. The head waiter tasted the water, listen, that had been turned into wine. He didn't know where it came from, even though the servants who had drawn the water knew. The head waiter called the groom and said, "Everyone serves the good wine first. They bring out the second-rate wine only when the guests are drinking freely. You kept the good wine until now." This was the first miraculous sign that Jesus did in Cana of Galilee. He revealed His glory, and His disciples believed in Him. So what does this mean? What does this sign mean of changing water into wine? I believe it has to do with how we connect with God. It's about how we get close to God. And how do we get close to God? Do we try to get close to God by doing good works, or even today staying ritually pure? That's what the Torah told them to do. Or is it really the way we get close to God? Is there a better way? When Jesus turned the water that was poured in the ritual purification jugs, when He turned that into wine, He wasn't just doing a favor for their family and friends, the bride and groom and the host family. Jesus was giving us a sign that a new age had begun. I think this is what John is trying to tell us when he's talking about the sign. The ritual water of one age must be replaced by the wine of a new age. Think on that. So just as a steward proclaimed that they had saved the best wine for last, I think John is making the same claim in this story about Jesus. You see, now through history for the Jews and for Israel, God had sent patriarchs and prophets. I mean, some of the best. I mean, we know their names like they just come off our lips like water now. I mean, they're so familiar. Moses, Abraham, right? Isaac and Jacob. And think about these. Isaiah, Jeremiah. All of these, they just come because we are so familiar with them. So God had sent these patriarchs, these prophets, these great men. But now, in Jesus, God had saved the best for last. I think what John is telling us is that Jesus is better than the prophets and the patriarchs. It's just like what the Lord proclaimed and God proclaimed to Isaiah. And He's talking about the Messiah. And listen to what He says about the Messiah. "Look, I am doing a new thing. Now what sprouts up? Don't you recognize it? I'm making a way in the desert, paths in the wilderness. That's what the Old Testament prophets are saying the same thing here. But how do we get close to God? Well, Jesus is showing to us the new path to God. Later in John's gospel, when he's talking about these miraculous signs, he says this. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Quite the claim. With all the world religions, it's quite the claim when they weren't sure yet that Jesus was the Messiah. And so I want to invite us to get close to God by getting to know Jesus or getting to know Jesus better. The interesting thing about Jesus is He wants to get to know you. The creator of the universe, billions and billions of we don't know how many galaxies, let alone planets. And in any of them, if there was one, in every galaxy, if there was one planet that was inhabited by some kind of a life form, the billions upon billions upon billions and billions and trillions of life forms it might be. Who knows? But I'm telling you that even with all of that, God in Jesus Christ wants to know you. He does. He wants to know you. That's one other thing I want to say about this story. I think we should understand as John tells the story. I think we also need to see the abundant way that Jesus does things. Sometimes we have a tendency to run in a scarcity mode, but Jesus, God wants us to see His generosity, the way He does things abundantly. His friends had run out of wine. Jesus' friends had. And I suppose one of His options would have been to say, hey, why don't you grab a couple of those jugs and let's get some wine. I think that'll be enough to get us through the last days of our thing. We can kind of put a little water with it, water it down just a touch. Nobody's expecting the good stuff now. They're expecting the watered down wine now. So He could have said, why don't you fill up a couple of those stone jars, and I think that'll be enough. But that's not how Jesus does things. That's not how God does things. So who is this Jesus that we're learning more about in these stories? He's the one that says, normally, I don't do this. But let's keep this party going. Let's keep this thing working. And so the way I calculate, I did some work in my limited math abilities. I did some calculating, and the best I calculated it with the 6 big jars of water turned into wine filled to the brim, that Jesus made approximately 900 bottles of wine in today's way we bottle it today. 900 bottles of wine. That's enough to fill any one of our wine cellars, right? Well, it was big enough to fill mine. I'll put it that way. Right? 900 bottles of wine, and they're already halfway through the process. That, my friends, is abundance. That's a lot. Think about it. See, the sign is a manifestation of Jesus' glory. And when Jesus provides, He doesn't just give a little bit, and it's not the watered down. He gives an abundance. It's the best wine. Totally turned on its head from what normally would happen. Best wine is served last. And He gives more than enough. In abundance. You see, when God gives to us, His gifts are extravagant. His love is extravagant. And then in the story of the wedding, Jesus shows us that God's love is more than enough. When God gives you something, it's of the highest quality. And I assure you, that highest quality things cost something. And so God also gives us things that cost a lot. For instance, our salvation and free grace and all of those things that we sometimes throw around as cheap things because they're free to us, but yet the price that God paid was the Son, His own Son. So the highest quality He gives us, the best He saves to last in Jesus. But I assure you it comes at a high cost. But His gifts are awesome. So here's what I mean. You know that thing that you did, back a ways, back in time, and you think there's no way that you could be forgiven? I think what this story is telling us that no. That God is telling us that Jesus is saying, my grace and my forgiveness are big enough to forgive you for that biggest thing. And on top of that, there's still enough grace and forgiveness to spare. God has given more than enough, even in His grace and forgiveness. So as I close, when you see this miracle at Cana of Galilee, what do you see? It's more than just Jesus providing a little wine at the end of a wedding. I see, when I look at this, the sign that John wants to see, I see God being active in our lives. I see that God is able to do things that we don't think are in any way possible. I see the one who loves us and calls us to share God's love with others. I see a little more clearly who Jesus really is as I continue to learn to follow Jesus. Would you bow with me in prayer?